So as everybody's getting back and settling, we're going to kind of work on beginning the second presentation. Greetings to those on the web, greetings to those in the room, greetings to those at Twitter at large. I'm Molly Brown, and I'm going to be presenting a presentation called Confronting the Curriculum, Incorporating Radical Empathy into Archival Training. Below is my email as well as my Twitter handle. Contact me. I'd love to hear from you. But I am just really grateful to be here to speak with you. I want to thank the DERAIL crew. And I also want to thank all of you for being here and being present. That's a big gift, I think. So I'm here to talk to you about how we as information professionals, we as archivists, and we as people can incorporate radical empathy into our work. And this is also a part of a framework of feminist ethics of care. So we're going to incorporate that into our work as well as our communities. So to share with you my plans for today, I'm here to first explain what I mean by radical empathy, as well as acknowledge those that created the term radical empathy in the context that I'm going to use, as well as the scholarship that I've been using for this presentation. And then I'm going to talk about how we can incorporate radical empathy into the library science and specifically archival curriculum at Simmons. And then I hope we can all come together as a discussion group and kind of talk about what we think radical empathy means by the end of this presentation, where we think it could fit into our own work, or where we think it might not fit in. So I look forward to talking with you all at the end, because that will happen. All right, so we are good. So the reason that I am able to speak with you today is because of the work of Michelle Caswell and Marika Seifer. And we are live with the webcam. So, welcome. Yeah, no, that's fine. So the title may be a little obscured at present, but the title of the article is, no, it's okay. From human rights to feminist ethics, radical empathy in the archives. And these are folks that are at UCLA. I highly recommend that you read this article. I, as a tiny archivist entering the library science world, was very concerned with how to incorporate emotions and emotional care into archives, because I do think that they are very emotional spaces. And it wasn't until I read this work here that I was able to really catalyze that into a more concrete space. And so first, I want to kind of explain the work that these two have done in this article, because I think it's really important to understand going forward what I'm going to talk about and what I'm trying to incorporate in my work as well as in my class curriculum. So how are we feeling? We're all on track? Feeling good? Great. All right. So just to kind of frame the article, in their article, Michelle Caswell and Marika Seifer proposed that rather than using a rights-based legalistic framework in archives, we could instead incorporate a feminist ethics of care, which also incites radical empathy. They called it archivists incorporating affective responsibilities, because we are all acknowledging that we are connected. We are not free individuals moving around the world, not affecting anyone. Me speaking here, you listening, that is an affective relationship, as is our work as information professionals. And I think that this affective responsibility that we acknowledge, this connected framework, it works to create a more inclusive, warm, and emotional space. And when I mean inclusive, I'm here to talk about how archives have not been inclusive, how they have been racist, how they have been whitewashed, how they have been hetero, as well as classist, among other origins where they came from too. And so Seifer and Caswell assert that the feminist ethics of care and radical empathy help negotiate the issues of power, exclusion, and silences inherent in the archival field. So I want to read some quotes as we go along. I'll try to note when I'm quoting, because I think that their words are important to hear today. So Caswell and Seifer proposed and wrote that, quote, an archival approach marked by radical empathy would require archives to make survivors and implicated communities not just a target group of users, but central focal points in all aspects of the archival endeavor. An ethics of care would transform the reading room from a cold, elitist, institutional environment to an affective, user-oriented, community-centered service space. Now, there will be more on the reading room later, but I do want you to reflect on the notion of a service space. This idea of service, that we are here to serve and share. And I kind of want you to hold that and think about that throughout the rest of this presentation. To give the definition that Caswell and Cipher offer of radical empathy, they talk about it as the work of hospitality, and not hospitality as it is often ascribed to women being hospitable or in other sort of gendered cliches, but hospitality in sharing, caring, and being radically empathetic. Part of this definition is empathy, which is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as an understanding and appreciation of another person's feelings and experiences. But also, it's important to caution that this empathy is not appropriation. It's not taking someone's experience for their own. Rather, it's acknowledging that someone else's experiences, they are their own. So just to kind of be cautious in that, because sometimes empathy can be used and named, but it's not really performed. And then to talk, I've been using the term the framework of feminist ethics of care, and to kind of give more light to that, it's another social justice framework that contrasts with what Cipher and Caswell describe as the rights-based framework, which, as I earlier stated, is more of an individual rights, legal rights to privacy and matters such as that. But they push back on this framework in the article as it doesn't acknowledge our connections. It doesn't acknowledge this sort of emotional space that information as a whole has, because people are involved in it. And so they pose a question that I think is a nice question to kind of begin more of my own personal discussion today. What happens when we scratch beneath the surface of the veneer of detached professionalism and start to think of the record keepers and archivists less as sentinels of accountability and more as caregivers? So here we are with our little noun project icon, archivists as caregivers, information professionals as caregivers. And again, it's important to engage in this caregiving relationship without appropriation. They also caution in their article, Caswell and Cipher, that, quote, this caregiver relationship is not to erase differences between bodies, not to turn a blind eye to power differentials, and not to reinforce hierarchies that permanently position some as caregivers and others as recipients. This is a symbiotic relationship of care. It is not where you as the archivist are the only caregivers. It is a mutual affective relationship. And I think that's another good thing to keep in mind, that there's care both ways. So empathy in the space of the caregiver, in the structure of the feminist ethics of care, is not about believing you know exactly how someone feels or know exactly what someone has experienced. It's about understanding yourself and another. Their experiences as their own and your experiences as your own, and trying to do the work of listening to understand, seeking connection, and acknowledging disconnects. So there are specific relationships with the archivist in the ethics of care in radical empathy that Caswell and Cipher talk about. And I'm going to be incorporating these relationships into my later talk about the curriculum. So at the center is radical empathy, and the relationships that are involved are the archivist as record and record creator, so the person that we acknowledge that created the record, the archivist and the record user, the person that may be coming to the reading room or accessing it online digitally to use the record that the archivist has given access to, the archivist and the record subject, so the person, people, communities that are described in the records, and then also the artist, the archivist, and the community. And I think that this is one relationship that isn't given much talk about in our specific curriculum, in my specific experience as a library science student. The community often is like a lowercase c community. It's not a body of people that we consult or collaborate with. It's rather you describe the community. So I'll talk later about the consultation and collaboration with community members, but I think it's important to kind of recognize where my personal biases, archivist and community, is something that I've been focusing a lot in my own work. And so to kind of center more the discussion on archivist and record creator, Caswell and Cipher give a really great quote that I will now say. Quote, by stewarding a collection, the archivist enters into a relationship of care with the record creator, in which the archivist must do their best not only to empathize with the record creator, but also to allow that empathy to inform the archival decision-making processes. So the creator may be long past and maybe 90 years ago, but you can still engage emotionally, engage personally with the collections, as well as what you may not know. Try to know what you don't know. Think about that, because that's an important space to be reflective on. And then there were two examples in this article that I thought were really interesting and important to understanding the sort of framework and theories that they propose. Michelle Caswell spoke about, or wrote about, the South Asian American Digital Archive when speaking about the effective responsibility between the archivist and the record creator. In this anecdote, Caswell discussed when she was processing an individual that was an immigrant to America's collections, there was a suicide note. And it said, no one else should read this. It was written for the family, and it was written for nobody else, and it was very clearly marked on this letter that this was not for anybody's eyes. Caswell made the decision not to incorporate this into the collection, not to read it as the processor, and to be empathetically engaged with this person's moment, this person's decision to write those words, and to respect that. While they were not present, they weren't the donor, they weren't somebody that might see that collection later. The granddaughter granted her full access to digitize the collections. That doesn't matter. What matters is this emotional relationship and this emotional cognizance of what a person asked for, what their own experience requested. And I thought that was a pretty moving idea and a pretty moving anecdote. And then Cypher offered the Lesbian Her Story Archives in Brooklyn, New York as a sort of, this more describes like the reference relationship between the archivist and the user. And so she entered into the Lesbian Her Story Archives and was offered a cup of tea by the caregiver of the archives that lives with the archives, and she wandered the stacks while, chatting and talking, and then they sat down and discussed some of the items that they saw. Now, I can understand if a moment of fear strikes in your heart, you think closed stacks, tea near archive records. It's terrifying, perhaps, but also think about the effect that has. When you're hearing about narratives of people that you may identify with, that you may want to see yourself represented in those records, and then you are able to enter into a space and wander and explore and experience and discover, that's pretty neat. And then when you contrast that with the reading room that's surveilled, that you sign a release form, that's governed by silence rather than conversation, that's a pretty stark contrast. And I think that this, although it may not be feasible for other archives, is a pretty cool thing to think about incorporating. Whether it just be talking, discussing with your patron what's there, what they're discovering. You don't have to offer them tea. That's okay. I understand. Liquids are scary. But you can offer a bit of yourself to them, and maybe they can offer that back. So I thought that this was a really powerful example, and I wanted to incorporate it in what I'm talking about today. And so although Caswell and Cypher, in their article, they draw a lot on victims of trauma, marginalized communities, and lots of archives of violence, I'm going to be more generally discussing archives as a whole, and they do insert that into their discussion as well, where even though it may not be a special collection that includes violence or includes trauma, although many of them often do, even though we don't acknowledge or describe that, there's still a responsibility for empathy, a responsibility for community, and a responsibility for your relationship with the record creator, the record subject, the user, and the community. All right, so here we are, Simmons College, School of Library Science. There are a number of programs, and I apologize, I will not be incorporating concretely radical empathy into each of those. I did look specifically into archival management. However, I did think of one course, And you can actually see Rachel Karasik represented under the children's literature, which she's not a part of, but is happy to advocate for. But you see all of these programs, and I would still like to uphold that radical empathy can be incorporated into all of those. And I was trying to think about classes that we all took together that were all part of our universal requirement, where we could incorporate this notion of empathy, and boy, did I think of one. So we have reference here. And I think in translation from Google Slides to PowerPoint, it's obscured, but maybe that's a metaphor. So LIS 407 reference, obscured by the little noun project icon. I think that empathetic engagement with users is something that as a whole we can get behind, right? Somebody comes up to a desk, you don't want to just disengage, you don't want it to be a transaction. But I think often in our education, and especially in reference, you think about finding the information. What happens if you aren't a specialist in science? How do you go into those biology encyclopedias? And then you go into the library, you explore the encyclopedias. But I felt like a lot of the test interactions that we did with our classmates weren't necessarily as engaged with the empathetic and emotional space that a reference space can often generate. So I want to acknowledge some emotional stakes here at the reference desk as a user and also as an information professional. There's the fear of not knowing on both sides. You don't know the right question, you don't know the right answer, you misheard the question, you make mistakes. That fear of not knowing can persist throughout the whole transaction, but you can still empathetically engage inside of that. There's also the fear of discovering something that's unexpected that maybe you didn't want to find. There can be some pretty traumatic records in archives that are not described, or that are not acknowledged, or that are misdescribed, and that can be a pretty intense emotional experience. And also, there can be the fear and the emotional stake of not finding what you thought you could. And in a library setting, we talk about that a little when we think about, queer teenagers looking for a good book to read. And maybe that's not present in your library. It certainly wasn't present in Billings, Montana's public library in my hometown. And there are other spaces where you don't find what you need. And how do you grapple with that? And how do you grapple with that with the information professional that also can't find that for you? And I think that's where you can kind of enter in a mutual acknowledgement. You can level with that person. You don't have to keep your work a secret. You don't have to keep your errors a secret. And so specifically in the archival space, in the frame of reference, I think the reading room is a space that could use a lot more empathy. And something that Hazel and Cypher mentioned was one thing that you can do that's pretty simple is keep a box of tissues at your desk, right? I work at a reference desk, and all of these kids that are either having hard days or hard colds, they come and ask for a tissue. And that's a pretty sensitive thing. If you're snotty and you need a tissue, that's vulnerable, right? And it's not there. You say, oh, use the toilet paper. That's not care. That's not empathy. What if you needed the tissue? I think that's it's a basic example, and it's not so emotionally bound, but I think that it can really make a granular moment of vulnerability. And how do we take care for that? How do we accommodate that? So just something to keep in mind, how we can all incorporate our tissue boxes wherever we go. So again, kind of a theme like the space of service, the tissue box. Put those in your mental toolbox, maybe. All right. So now we're going to enter into more of a specific archival realm. But I think that this is something that we can all get behind. So first, I would like to contend with LIS 438, Introduction to Archival Methods and Services. Cool. So as an introductory course, this course should be showing the potential of archives. It can be both positive and negative potential. And I think it's in this class that we really learn about the relationship between the archivist and the record creator, and the archivist and the record subject. However, this is not so much emphasized, or at least in my personal experience and my surveying of the various syllabi. I also think that this is a course where you learn about the different types of archivists that you can be. And it's categorized as processing archivist. You can be a reference archivist, an outreach archivist, an appraiser. And it's generally at this time where people say, if you're particularly introverted, if you don't like working with people, become a processing archivist. And that's not cool, because on the one hand, you don't have to become a processing archivist if you're introverted. You don't have to become a processing archivist if you aren't sure how to navigate relationships with people. And either way, as a processing archivist, you are navigating relationships. The record subject is a relationship. You are navigating relationships with communities. You are navigating relationships with people that are 90 years gone. And that's still working with people. And that's still having to empathetically and emotionally engage. So when you hear that, and I think in the LAS profession, we hear about that a lot. Don't let that sit. You know what you can do, and you know that you have engaged with your classmates. You've arrived at DERAIL. You've tweeted at DERAIL. And I think that that's engagement with people too. So that's one thing that arrived at the course that I think we can radically empathize that. We can pivot that. And then there also is this notion that archives are a place for research. And within that notion, it is only a place for researchers. It's only a place for academics. It's only a place for people who know what they want to find, can find the evidence for it, and can then make it into something. And I don't think that's fair. Because I think, and Cypher and Caswell say this, we can no longer ethically think of archives as spaces for researchers, as archives as spaces for academics. And I think that really rings true for me. Because there are people that are looking for their families there. There are people that are looking for other folks that have experienced certain types of trauma. Or maybe, I'm a gal from Montana, I'm looking for other Montanans. I'm not always going for the research. And I think that we're so often trained to think about the service of research and the framing for the academic search, the academic paper, that underrides our notion of access, our method of creating an archive in a space that preserves so that we can access. And we're often talking about physical goods here. We're talking about the folders, the folder names, the boxes, the shelves. And they're important, and I certainly do not want to ignore that. But within those folders, there are people. Grabbing those boxes, there are people. And reading those records are people. And I don't think that that's emphasized enough. And I think in our classes, we're often subject to lectures where we should be subject to discussion, we should be subject to collaboration, and more in-class, in-practice efforts. Because you can do the reference interaction, you can practice that, but maybe make it more concrete, make it more serious. Put an archive record box on that table and be an archivist that doesn't know what's in it. And see how that goes. Navigate that fear, that state of not knowing. And then also, I think this is a space where we talk about creatorship a lot, and I think that we don't often talk about how problematic choosing the creator can be. And this is something that Caswell and Cypher introduced into their work here too. They talk about, in Australia, the scholar Livia Iacovino, and she created this concept of co-creatorship. The creator and the subject are both creators. The person being described has ownership over that record too. And well, they should. And I think that in our forms of description, there's a lot of constricting and there's a lot of alienating. And if you're interested in that concept, I may not break into it too hard here, but you should check out Jarrett Drake. He is an archivist that has said a lot about the notion of provenance, which is problematic, as well as the notion of finding aids too. And I don't know if I inserted Jarrett Drake on my works cited, but boy, will I tweet it at the end of this, so don't worry. That will come. All right. And then finally, to talk about archival methods in this class, I want to insert radical empathy as an archival method. And I think that it can be present in any archive. Often you think about this sort of emotional engagement only being for community archives, only being for those new archives that are different and social justice oriented, where all archives are social justice oriented. And I'm sorry if that's a surprise for some individuals, but it's really neat. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity. And I think that there's a way that we can share the work and share our secrets, share our trade, share our training, and create an archival method that everybody can engage in. And now we talk about access and use. And in this class of access and use, I learned about description. I did not learn about communities. I did not learn about the people that I'm describing. It wasn't discussed in an emotional space. There were discussions where we talked about how we acknowledge our biases in the archive, right? How we navigate our, our lack of knowledge, or maybe our slanted knowledge, and do we insert that in the finding aid? How do we deal with that? And the notion of that conversation was, well, we're talking about it. That's the first step. And I think while talking about is good, and that's what I'm doing, I think we can also act on it. And I think that it can be taking that discussion from just me and my fellow archivists to me and the person that I'm handing that archival box to. The finding aid does not have to be an unvocalized document. And I think that if we posit the finding aid as more of a conversation rather than a Microsoft Word doc that's going to be preserved for the next few years, I think that that's more effective. Because if you hand someone a piece of paper that's formatted in a way that they aren't comfortable with or that they aren't familiar with, that takes time to understand. And that also can be intimidating. And I think that, it's the same sort of intimidation when you have to sign a form and it says, I accept and agree to these terms, and you don't have somebody explaining those terms to you. It's up to you to interpret and understand. That's a lot of work to put on one person, and especially in a space where they may not feel comfortable or they may not know. That just not knowing is uncomfortable. And so I think we can talk about that with people, and I think that discussion is important. And again, I want to remind you that we cannot ethically continue to conceive of our primary users as academic scholars. That's what Cipher and Caswell said. And this is another space where we cannot ethically continue to think of people as being able to understand our finding aid terms and being able to understand what provenance is and being able to understand who is excluded from provenance. I think that can be a conversation, and I know that time is limited, and I know that people are limited as well, and resources are tight, but I think a conversation is free, and that can be a starting place at least. And that's something that I'm navigating too, is how to insert that and get another person to engage, because what if the user isn't ready to converse? That's okay too. You can kind of create a flow to talk about it and to talk about these things that may not be familiar. And then there's establishing archives and manuscript programs. And this is kind of where I want to talk about the archivist and the community. Because I think we talk about collaborating with other libraries. We talk about collaborating with other archives. But when we're describing archival records, why are we not collaborating with the communities that are being described within them? If an archive has an Indigenous collection, should they not contact that Indigenous community to find out where they're at, to find out what they think about the material, what their personal narrative would be? And it doesn't necessarily have to be like signing a release form and sliding the box of materials over to them. It can still be discussing, and it can still, you as the archivist can have the control over the processing, but maybe delineate that a bit, move that from a top down to a side to side. And I think that could be a much more genuine and helpful mode of description. So that's another thing that I've been considering, is how to navigate starting those discussions too. Because as Nicole said, it is not the marginalized community job to teach. And I think that is a really great point and something that we should carry with us too. But I think it's all our jobs to collaborate, and it's all of our jobs to recognize spaces where people are being silenced and they don't need your voice yet. They need other voices. And so that's just been something that I've been thinking about. But with these two classes, 440 and 442, I want people to think about challenging the reading room, maybe making it not silent. Challenging the finding aid, maybe making that not silent, making that vocal. And those are kind of my concrete insertions into our present curriculum. And I want to acknowledge, too, that our current curriculum is not perfect by any means. And I think my working with it now is I'm trying to conceptualize how we can first insert it into the standardized Simmons understanding of archival education. But then I think there's also the work to transform it beyond this curriculum, to make new classes, new titles, to expand what the words access and use really mean. And to expand what a method or what a service is. And I think that that's not in these classes. And it's not always the fault of the professors. It's not always the fault of the students, but it is our job to talk about it and to put that talk into action. So although I'm working within an existing structure here, I think that there's a lot of potential for a new structure. And a lot of potential to empathetically engage in the building of that as a community. And so then I want to posit this, that we here as students are also caregivers. Y'all in this room, you're a caregiver. Thank you. And I appreciate that you are here to listen to me, and I appreciate that I can't wait to listen to you in our discussion. But that's what's coming up. So here we're going to learn how to empathetically engage with one another. We're all seated at tables, we may all be involved in different fields, and that's great, because then I think we can kind of tabulate this notion of radical empathy as an information service, because it's not exclusive to archives. Empathy is a pretty universal notion, but when you couch it into the framework of feminist ethics of care, it can be really powerful and really effective and really connecting. And I think that what Caswell and Cypher have done here in their article can be turned into the whole of library science. And so what we're going to do now is, we can talk as a whole group or we can talk in our tables, but I think maybe first we'll do some questions if you have any, and then we can kind of talk as a whole. And if it seems more germane to talk at our tables, we can do that too. Because I love presenting to you, and I thank you for listening to me, but I also want to hear your words on radical empathy and how you feel it fits into your field. So there we go. Let's talk. Okay. So how do we feel about starting off as a group, a large group, and kind of discussing radical empathy and doing questions? Does that make sense to everyone, or would you rather start tables? Whole group it is. All right. So where are questions?
Does anybody have any questions straight up?
If radical empathy was unclear?
How would you recommend introducing the idea of radical empathy to an institution that maybe wouldn't be as receptive to it?
I think one way to rebrand the notion of radical empathy is to talk about it as a conversation, and a conversation that's not just with the proprietors of information. Because I think, the term radical and the term empathy, to some people, first I think radical, oh boy, you're going to change my system. Empathy, I'm not ready to get emotional. But I think if you frame it as conversation, that can be helpful. But that's a great point, is that is going to be contextual for sure. And stepping into this room too, I know that y'all have been a little more receptive to new concepts of library science. You signed up for DERAIL. And so this is a very unique space to engage in this issue in, certainly. But you ask a great question of how do we really help people understand, empathetically frame stuff so that we can all engage in it comfortably. I think you have a microphone coming in hot.
We coming.
Des is on the way.
I guess this is less of a question, but more maybe opening up for a conversation. I guess my biggest concern, even though I love the notion of radical empathy, would be crossing boundaries and what we can kind of do to make sure that, if a patron comes in, and I'm particularly thinking of public librarianship here, If you sort of radically empathize and someone's really uncomfortable with that, and there's sort of pushback to that, I don't know, like if that needs to be something addressed in the policy to kind of make sure that information professionals are not crossing any lines in their attempts to empathize. I don't know if I have really a question behind that, just sort of how we would address that.
And so by crossing lines, could you give an example of like maybe a specific line of one could cross? Just so I can reframe an answer.
I mean, I guess I'm thinking, you know, when somebody comes to the counter and, or you gave, the example of like, if the teen came in looking for LGBTQ materials and is feeling kind of upset about their inability to find those and they're not available in your library, how much is appropriate for you to empathize without getting to the point where you might make them uncomfortable, or you might, as much as you want to go ahead and totally share and empathize with them, sometimes that might be too much for people. I'm just sort of thinking, would you recommend that that's something that is addressed within the policies of the library, that, this is actually spelled out, that this is sort of a tack that the library is taking, just so that, you can protect yourselves and also protect your patrons and people who are coming in.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I think perhaps something that I didn't make loud enough is that empathizing is listening as much as sharing. So if I were a librarian and there was a teen looking for some queer fiction and couldn't find it, I don't think that I would necessarily be offering my own narrative unless it seemed like a space that would be welcome to it. And I think I can understand what you're saying, like if I'm like trying to emotionally engage and situate and they're not ready for that and would rather just like leave and not happy with, but take the situation and the transaction as is, I think that's fine. But I think it's important to make the information space a conduit rather than a destination. And so rather than like empathizing and like trying to make it an emotional space, you could then make it a resource space and say like, hey, I'm sorry you didn't find this, but I want to generate resources for you to find it elsewhere. So yeah, that's a great point though. Thank you.
It is okay. Thank you. I think that one point to make is that there's a difference between like straight up empathy and compassion. And it was hard for the first for me, but within the last couple of days, I read something about empathy versus compassion, how like compassion can actually be what more people are looking for rather than like getting down into the hole, trying to like experience something that maybe is impossible for you to experience this other person's experiences. That compassion can actually be especially helpful. And I feel like if you like Google like empathy and compassion and something like that, that maybe you'll find what I'm thinking of. Maybe it's just in my brain, but I think thinking about compassion as well as empathy is important.
Absolutely, and I think compassion is also embedded into the work of caregiving that Caswell and Cypher bring up. And I think that empathy maybe is more so best inserted into structural components and structural considerations, or maybe restructuring considerations. But that's a great point that there's a space for compassion sometimes more than empathy.
I just wanted to kind of give an example of how this works in the real world as not so recent grad. Recent enough that I'm here. But I work on a recent racism project at a small university. I'm an archivist, kind of, in the capital of the Confederacy. And I work at a predominantly white institution that has a really long history of being the worst. They know it. I know it. We all know it. But that is making a genuine effort to change things. And one of the things that I found really important in this conversation about community is I went in there and it would be so easy for me to spend 2 years there just like in the archive, let me find out things about racism and like make an omniscient collection and like that's it. And it sits there. And I was like, I'm not doing that. Partially because I went here and like worked with all the awesome folks that did DERAIL last year. and like really got turned on to community building. So one of the first things that I did was reach out to people in the Richmond community. I'm talking about Richmond, Virginia. Where it's one right now. And there are people in the community that are doing public history work. I immediately found someone who is doing public history, is a Wicklow historian that is unfunded outside of grants, that is already doing this work about Richmond, and I hooked up with her, and now we're doing a bunch of work together, including getting undergraduate students involved in this. So we should talk about teaching undergrads. But once you get into a position where you have the funding and the resources to do this kind of work, I highly recommend turning around and going to the community and treating it like a capital C community, because the partnership that I have right now is mind-blowing and awesome, and we're doing so much more work than I could have ever done on my own. And also, I have a budget and I can pay her for her work, which is also really important in this community building.
Thank you. That's a really cool example. Yeah, do any of y'all have other examples? I think we have one that's over at that corner of the room. Or we have 2 minutes left also.
Thanks. So I manage the reading room at my institution, so I'm really interested in the reading room space that you addressed a little bit. So I'm interested if you have any kind of concrete examples about how to balance the expectations of researchers who anticipate walking into a really traditional silent reading room, and our community of researchers who is intimidated by that space or finds it hostile or just like scary. So I'm interested if you have any thoughts on like what the implementation of a more empathetic, radically empathetic reading room could look like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and I certainly do not have all the answers for this at all. But in ways that I've considered is first acknowledging, right, that you're in the space that is traditionally not warm, traditionally hostile, maybe traditionally silent, traditionally uncomfortable for folks. And I'm not saying that all reading rooms are, by any means, but I'm saying that it's important to recognize the history and the background of the archival reading room and the space that it has been. And so I think that that can almost be like an introduction. Obviously, you're not going to say like, "Hi, I'm Molly. Welcome to this space that's traditionally hostile. I want to make this happen." But I do think that there is a way to say like, you know, if you have moments of discomfort in the reading room, either in that you need a conversation to work through what you're doing, or otherwise, I'm here. And I think it's being present too, absolutely. But I think that there are more ways to reach that out just in acknowledging where you're at. And that'll do. So tweet me, email me, and thank you.